The year is 793 CE. The morning mist clings to the holy island of Lindisfarne like the breath of sleeping saints, and the monks are chanting their dawn prayers when death comes from the sea. Long ships with dragon heads and striped sails slice through the North Sea waves like sea serpents made real. Warriors with axes gleaming and war cries echoing across the water are about to change the course of European history forever. But this isn't just another tale of raiders and plunder. This is the story of the Vikings, explorers who reached America 500 years before Columbus, traders who connected Europe to Asia, kings who founded dynasties that still rule today. Tonight, let me take you on a journey to the fjords of Scandinavia, where the northern lights dance over longships and the spirits of ancient warriors still sail the whale road to Valhalla. Close your eyes, feel the spray of Arctic waves on your face, hear the creak of oak planks and the whisper of wind through woolen sails, and let the saga of the Vikings carry you into dreams of distant shores and endless adventure. In the beginning, there was only ice and fire. Across the vast expanse of Scandinavia, glaciers carved valleys deep as cathedral naves, while volcanic peaks thrust toward skies painted in impossible shades of green and gold. This was a land where winter night lasted for months and summer sun never set, where the aurora borealis danced like the spirits of fallen warriors, where the very earth seemed alive with gods and giants locked in eternal conflict. It was here, in this realm of extremes, that the people who would become the Vikings first learned the lessons that would define their character for centuries to come. The harsh climate taught them endurance and the value of careful planning. The fragmented landscape of islands, peninsulas, and mountain-guarded valleys taught them seamanship and independence. Most importantly, the scarcity of fertile land taught them that survival often required looking beyond the horizon for opportunity and sustenance. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Germanic tribes who would evolve into the Viking peoples arrived in Scandinavia around 500 BCE, during the Late Bronze Age. They brought with them sophisticated metalworking skills, agricultural techniques, and social structures that would form the foundation of Norse civilization. But it was their adaptation to the unique challenges of Northern Europe that created the distinctive culture we remember as Viking. The early Scandinavians were not the savage barbarians that later Christian chroniclers would describe. They were skilled craftsmen who created weapons and jewelry of exceptional beauty and functionality. Their bronze work, preserved in peat bogs and burial mounds, displays artistic sophistication that rivals anything produced in the Mediterranean world. They were also innovative farmers who developed agricultural techniques specifically adapted to short growing seasons and marginal soils. But perhaps most importantly, they were master boat builders whose vessels would eventually carry them to every corner of the known world and beyond. The evolution of Scandinavian shipbuilding represents one of humanity's great technological achievements, a gradual refinement that would culminate in the legendary longships that made the Viking Age possible. The religious beliefs that shaped early Scandinavian society were deeply connected to their natural environment. They worshipped gods who embodied the forces of nature. Thor with his hammer representing thunder, Freyr bringing fertility to the land, Odin the All-Father, who rode the eight-legged horse Sleipnir across the sky. These weren't distant deities, dwelling in marble temples, but active participants in daily life who could be encountered in storms at sea, in the success or failure of crops, in the outcome of battles. The concept of fate, or weird, was central to Norse worldview. They believed that destiny was woven by the three Norns, past, present, and future, and that even gods were subject to the patterns they created. This fatalistic philosophy would later give Viking warriors their legendary fearlessness in battle, for they understood that the day of their death was already determined, making cowardice both pointless and shameful. The social structure that emerged in early Scandinavian society was based on the extended family unit called a clan. These kinship groups provided economic cooperation, military support, and social identity in a harsh environment where individual survival was often impossible. The bonds of kinship created obligations that extended across generations, with blood, feuds, and oaths of loyalty shaping relationships between families and communities. Leadership within these early societies was typically earned through a combination of martial prowess, wisdom in counsel, and the ability to provide for followers. through successful raids or trading expeditions. Kings and jarls, earls, were expected to be generous with their wealth, distributing treasure and land to maintain the loyalty of their warriors. This gift-giving culture created a social contract based on mutual obligation rather than absolute authority. The role of women in early Scandinavian society was more complex and influential than in many contemporary cultures. While men typically handled warfare and long-distance trade, women managed household economies, participated in religious ceremonies, and could inherit property. Some women, known as vulvas or seeresses, served as spiritual advisors whose prophecies could influence major decisions. The concept of the shield maiden, though probably rare in reality, reflected cultural ideals that valued courage and determination, regardless of gender. The agricultural foundation of early Scandinavian society was supplemented by hunting, fishing, and primitive mining operations that extracted iron from bog deposits. These activities created the economic surplus necessary for supporting specialized craftsmen and part-time warriors. More importantly, they fostered the skills that would later prove essential for long-distance exploration, navigation, resource management, and the ability to survive in unfamiliar environments. The burial practices of early Scandinavians reveal a sophisticated understanding of death and the afterlife. Ship burials, where the deceased were interred in actual vessels or ship-shaped stone arrangements, reflected beliefs about the journey to the realm of the dead. The grave goods that accompanied these burials, weapons, jewelry, tools, and sometimes sacrificed animals or slaves, suggest concepts of continued existence after death that would later be elaborated in the mythology of Valhalla and otherworldly realms. The runic writing system that developed during this period served both practical and magical purposes. Runes were used for marking ownership, recording transactions, and communicating over distances, but they were also believed to possess inherent power when carved in the proper combinations. The ability to read and write runes was considered a form of magic, and runic inscriptions often served as protective charms or curses. The technological innovations that emerged from early Scandinavian culture reflected the practical needs of people living in a challenging environment. Iron tools and weapons were perfected through centuries of experimentation, while techniques for preserving food, constructing buildings, and creating textiles were adapted to local conditions and materials. These innovations would later prove crucial when Vikings ventured into unfamiliar climates and terrains. The political organization of early Scandinavian society was characterized by a balance between local autonomy and regional cooperation. Individual farmsteads and villages maintained their independence in daily affairs, but they participated in larger assemblies called things where disputes were resolved and collective decisions were made. These assemblies represented an early form of democratic governance that would influence political development throughout Northern Europe. The concept of honor was central to Norse social values, encompassing not just personal courage but also faithfulness to oaths, generosity to followers, and protection of family and community. Honor was considered more valuable than life itself, and its loss could be worse than death. This honor culture created strong incentives for achievement while establishing clear expectations for behavior in various social situations. The seasonal rhythms that governed life in Scandinavia created distinctive patterns of activity that would later influence Viking expansion. Long winter nights were devoted to craftsmanship, storytelling, and planning for the following year's activities. Spring brought planting and the beginning of the sailing season, while summer was the time for trade, raiding, and exploration. Autumn meant harvest, preparation for winter, and the return of those who had spent the sailing season abroad. The development of specialized warrior classes within Scandinavian society reflected both the need for defense against hostile neighbors and the opportunities that martial skill created for personal advancement. Young men who showed aptitude for warfare could join the retinues of successful leaders, gaining training, equipment, and opportunities for wealth and fame that were not available through purely agricultural pursuits. The religious festivals that marked the changing seasons served multiple functions in early Scandinavian society. They provided occasions for communities to gather and strengthen social bonds, conducted religious ceremonies that were believed to ensure continued prosperity, and created opportunities for political and economic activities such as lawmaking and trade fairs. The artistic traditions that developed during this period reflected both local environmental influences and contact with other European cultures. Wood carving, metalwork, and textile production all reached high levels of sophistication, creating distinctive styles that would later be recognized throughout Europe and beyond. These artistic achievements served not just decorative purposes, but also communicated cultural values and social status. The gradual development of regional identities within Scandinavia created the foundation for the later kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Geographic factors such as mountain ranges, forests, and sea channels encouraged the development of distinct dialects, customs, and political organizations, while shared linguistic and cultural heritage maintained connections between different regions. As you feel yourself beginning to relax, imagine standing on a windswept promontory overlooking a Norwegian fjord on a clear winter night. The aurora borealis dances overhead in sheets of green and gold, while below you, the dark waters reflect starlight like scattered jewels. In the distance, you can see the orange glow of longhouse fires where families gather around their hearths, sharing stories of heroes and gods while craftsmen work by lamplight to create the weapons and ships that will carry their descendants to fame and fortune. This is the world that forged the Viking spirit, a place where natural beauty and natural danger were inseparable, where survival required both cooperation and competition, where the line between the human and divine worlds was thin enough that mortals could aspire to earn seats in the halls of the gods through their deeds in life. The stage is set, the players are ready, and the great adventure is about to begin. The children of the northern ice are about to burst onto the world stage, carrying with them all the accumulated wisdom and wildness of their harsh homeland, ready to explore, conquer, and transform every land their dragon-headed ships can reach. The rhythmic scraping of iron against wood echoes across the shoreline of Roskilde Fjord, as master shipwright Thorvald the Wise shapes the curved prow that will soon cut through waves from Iceland to Constantinople. It is the year 820 CE, and the Viking Age has reached its full flowering. In the shipyards of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, craftsmen are creating the vessels that will carry Norse warriors, traders, and explorers to every corner of the known world and beyond. But these are no ordinary ships. The longships emerging from Scandinavian boatyards represent the pinnacle of maritime technology, vessels so perfectly adapted to their purposes that their basic design would remain unchanged. For centuries, more than just transportation, they are works of art, symbols of power, and keys to an empire that would stretch from Greenland to the gates of Baghdad. The evolution of the longship was a gradual process spanning several centuries, driven by the practical needs of people who lived in a landscape where water was often the only highway. The early Scandinavians had inherited boat-building traditions from their Bronze Age ancestors, but it was their own innovations that created the revolutionary vessels that made the Viking expansion possible. The key breakthrough was the development of the clinker-built hull, where overlapping planks were riveted together to create a structure that was both strong and flexible. This construction technique, perfected through generations of experimentation, allowed Viking ships to bend with heavy seas, rather than breaking apart. The result was a vessel that could survive storms that would destroy more rigidly built ships. The materials used in longship construction reflected the abundant natural resources of Scandinavia. Oak provided the strength needed for the keel and framework, while pine and other softwoods were used for planking. Iron for rivets and fittings came from bog deposits that were worked in local forges. Perhaps most importantly, the long, straight pines of the northern forest provided the tall masts needed to carry the square sails that gave longships their speed and range. The design of the longship hull represented a masterful balance of competing requirements. The vessels needed to be fast enough to catch merchant ships and escape pursuit, shallow-drafted enough to navigate rivers and beach on any shoreline, stable enough to carry cargo and warriors, and flexible enough to survive North Atlantic storms. Achieving this balance required generations of refinement and testing by craftsmen whose lives often depended on the quality of their work. The most famous longships were the drekar, dragon ships, used by kings and great warriors. These vessels, stretching up to 180 feet in length, were floating works of art, whose dragon-headed prows and elaborately carved gunnels proclaimed the wealth and power of their owners. The largest could carry crews of over 100 men, making them formidable weapons of war as well as symbols of prestige. But the longship was not the only vessel in the Viking fleet. Smaller craft called carvi served as scouts and coastal raiders, while broad-beamed nur carried cargo and settlers across the open ocean. Each type was optimized for specific purposes, creating a flexible naval system that could adapt to any situation, from river raids to transoceanic exploration. The construction of a major longship was a community effort that could take years to complete. Master craftsmen planned the vessel and shaped its most critical components, while apprentices and laborers provided the muscle power needed for the heavy work. The entire process was governed by traditions passed down through generations, with specific rituals and customs, ensuring that both the technical and spiritual requirements were met. The decoration of longships reflected their dual nature as functional vessels and symbols of power. Dragon heads and other mythological creatures carved into prows were believed to possess protective powers, while the intricate interlace patterns that adorned gunnels and other visible surfaces demonstrated the owner's wealth and good taste. These decorations were not mere ornaments but integral parts of the ship's identity and spiritual power. The sailing characteristics that made longships so effective were the result of careful attention to hydrodynamic principles that Scandinavian shipwrights understood intuitively rather than mathematically. The long, narrow hulls minimized water resistance while maximizing speed, while the shallow draft allowed the vessels to navigate in waters where deeper ships would run aground. The flexible construction allowed the hull to work with the waves, rather than fighting them. The oars that powered longships when the wind failed were precisely matched to the vessel's dimensions and the strength of its crew. Each oarsman had his designated position and oar, and the rhythm of rowing was often maintained by the ship's poet or a designated caller whose chants helped coordinate the crew's efforts. This system allowed longships to maintain speed and direction, even in adverse conditions. The navigational techniques used by Viking sailors represent one of the great achievements of medieval technology. Without compass, sextant, or detailed charts, Norse navigators successfully crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using methods that combined careful observation with intuitive understanding of natural phenomena. They read the direction of waves and swells, the behavior of birds, the color of water, and the patterns of clouds to find their way across seemingly trackless seas. The logistics of longship voyages required careful planning and extensive preparation. Food and water had to be calculated for journeys that might last months, while space had to be found for weapons, trade goods, and personal possessions. The crew needed to include not just warriors and sailors, but also craftsmen who could repair damage, healers who could treat injuries, and leaders who could maintain discipline and morale during long and dangerous voyages. The social organization aboard longships reflected the egalitarian values of Viking society, while acknowledging the practical needs of maritime expeditions. The ship's captain had absolute authority during the voyage, but major decisions were often made collectively by the crew. Profits from trading or raiding were divided according to predetermined shares that reflected each man's contribution and social status. The maintenance of longships was a constant concern that required specialized knowledge and skills. The vessels needed to be regularly caulked to prevent leaking, their rigging needed frequent adjustment and repair, and their hulls needed protection from shipworms and other marine borers. This maintenance was often performed by the crew themselves, making every Viking warrior something of a maritime craftsman. The evolution of longship design continued throughout the Viking Age, as shipwrights responded to changing needs and conditions. Early vessels were optimized for coastal raiding, but later designs incorporated features needed for ocean exploration and long-distance trade. The largest ships built near the end of the Viking Age were massive vessels capable of carrying entire armies across the North Sea. The psychological impact of longships was as important as their practical capabilities. The sight of dragon-headed prows emerging from morning mist struck terror into the hearts of coastal dwellers throughout Europe, while the knowledge that Viking fleets could appear anywhere with little warning kept entire kingdoms in a state of nervous preparedness. The longship became a symbol of Viking power that was recognized and feared from Ireland to Constantinople. The construction techniques developed for longships influenced shipbuilding throughout northern Europe and beyond. The clinker-built hull became standard for vessels built in regions under Viking influence, while innovations in rigging, steering, and hull design were copied by craftsmen from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The longship represented a technological revolution that changed the course of maritime history. The rituals associated with longship construction and launching reflected the sacred nature of these vessels in Norse culture. Ships were often built at sites considered spiritually significant. Their construction was accompanied by sacrifices and ceremonies, and their launching was marked by festivals that involved entire communities. The ship was seen not just as a tool, but as a living entity with its own spirit and destiny. The naming conventions for longships reveal their importance in Viking culture. The greatest vessels bore names like Long Serpent, Iron Beard, and Raven of the Wind, appellations that suggested both their fearsome capabilities and their quasi-mythological status. These names became legendary throughout the Viking world, inspiring poets and storytellers to create sagas that celebrated both the ships and their crews. The economic impact of longship technology extended far beyond the shipyards where they were built. The iron industry expanded to meet the demand for rivets and fittings, forestry operations grew to supply the needed timber, and rope-making became a specialized craft that supported maritime activities. Entire communities came to depend on the longship trade for their prosperity. The training required to handle longships effectively began in childhood for most Vikings. Boys learned seamanship alongside farming and fighting, developing the skills that would make them valuable crew members on trading or raiding expeditions. This maritime education created a population that was uniquely equipped to exploit the opportunities that longship technology made possible. The preservation of longships through burial or deliberate sinking has provided modern archaeologists with remarkable insights into Viking shipbuilding techniques. Vessels like the Gokstad ship, the Oseberg ship, and the Skuldelev ships have revealed construction details that would otherwise be lost, allowing us to appreciate the sophistication of Viking maritime technology. As you feel the peaceful embrace of sleep approaching, imagine standing on a beach at dawn watching a longship being launched for the first time. The dragon head gleams with fresh paint and gilt while the square sail, dyed in bold stripes of red and yellow, flutters in the morning breeze. The crew, their weapons and sea chests already aboard, pushes the vessel into the surf as the rising sun turns the water to molten gold. This is more than just a ship setting out on another voyage. It is the embodiment of Viking ambition and skill, the physical manifestation of a culture that refused to accept the limitations imposed by geography or the cautious wisdom of more settled peoples. In the graceful curves of its hull and the fierce beauty of its dragon head, you can see the dreams of countless generations who looked beyond the horizon and dared to sail toward whatever lay beyond the edge of the known world. The dragon ships of the Vikings carried more than warriors and treasure. They carried the hopes and fears, the skills and stories, the very essence of a people who transformed themselves from Scandinavian farmers into the explorers, traders, and conquerors who would reshape the medieval world. And tonight, as you drift toward sleep, perhaps you too can hear the whisper of wind in square sails and feel the surge of the sea beneath a clinker-built hull, carrying you toward adventures that await beyond the whale road's distant horizon. The monastery bell at Lindisfarne tolls its morning call to prayer, but Brother Higbald pauses in his illuminated manuscript, stylus trembling in his hand. Something is wrong. The seabirds that usually cry and wheel above the holy island have fallen silent, and the gentle lapping of waves against the rocky shore has been replaced by a different sound, the rhythmic splash of many oars cutting through the North Sea swells. It is June 8th, 793 CE, and the Viking Age is about to begin with an explosion of violence that will echo through the centuries. On the horizon, dragon-headed longships emerge from the morning mist like creatures from nightmare, their striped sails furled for silent approach, their crews of fair-haired warriors scanning the monastery's walls for signs of resistance. What happens in the next few hours will mark the beginning of 3 centuries of Viking expansion that will transform medieval Europe. But this raid is about more than mere plunder. It represents the collision between 2 completely different worldviews. the Christian monks who have chosen lives of prayer and contemplation, and the Norse warriors who measure their worth through deeds of courage and the accumulation of treasure. The sacred and the secular, the peaceful and the violent, the settled and the wandering are about to meet in a conflict that will reshape both cultures. The choice of Lindisfarne as a target was no accident. The monastery was wealthy, famous throughout Christendom for its learning and holiness, and, most importantly, virtually undefended. Located on a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, it seemed safely isolated from the tribal warfare that plagued Anglo-Saxon England. The monks had never imagined that this isolation might make them vulnerable to attacks from the sea. The Viking warriors who leaped from their beached longships that fateful morning were the products of a culture that glorified martial prowess and measured success through the acquisition of wealth and fame. They were not mindless berserkers, despite later Christian accounts, but skilled fighters operating according to their own code of honor and practical objectives. Their goal was treasure, but they were prepared to fight for it if necessary. The weapons they carried reflected centuries of Scandinavian metallurgical expertise. Pattern-welded swords with names like Legbiter and Life-Taker were balanced instruments of death, while round shields painted with clan symbols provided protection without impeding mobility. Axes designed for both utility and combat could split skulls as easily as they split firewood, and spears with leaf-shaped points could punch through mail armor or be thrown with deadly accuracy. The raid itself was over quickly. The monks, caught completely by surprise, offered little resistance to warriors trained from childhood in the arts of combat. The monastery's treasures, gold and silver chalices, jeweled religious relics, illuminated manuscripts whose vellum pages were worth small fortunes, were loaded into the longships with efficient professionalism. Some monks were killed, others taken as slaves, and the survivors were left to contemplate the destruction of their peaceful world. The psychological impact of the Lindisfarne raid was immediate and profound. The attack on one of Christendom's most sacred sites seemed to herald the coming of the apocalypse to many contemporary observers. Alcuin of York wrote to King Ethelred of Northumbria, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. But from the Viking perspective, Lindisfarne was simply a successful business venture." The raiders returned to their Scandinavian bases with wealth that enhanced their reputation and attracted new followers for future expeditions. The success of the raid proved that the Christian kingdoms were vulnerable to seaborne attack, encouraging other Viking leaders to organize their own expeditions against targets that had previously seemed safely beyond their reach. The organization of Viking raiding expeditions reflected the decentralized nature of Scandinavian society. Individual jarls, earls, or successful warriors would organize expeditions, recruiting crews through a combination of personal relationships, shared kinship, and the promise of profit. These were not royal armies, but private enterprises, though they often operated with the knowledge and sometimes the encouragement of regional kings. The strategies employed by Viking raiders took advantage of their superior mobility and the element of surprise. Longships could travel faster than news of their approach, allowing raiders to strike targets before defenders could organize effective resistance. The shallow draft of the vessels allowed them to navigate rivers far inland, bringing the threat of Viking attack to communities that had never seen the sea. The selection of targets required careful intelligence gathering and strategic thinking. Monasteries were preferred because they contained portable wealth and were typically undefended, but Viking raiders also attacked trading centers, royal residences, and even fortified towns when the potential rewards justified the risks. The Esai raiders developed an intimate knowledge of European geography, political conditions, and seasonal patterns that helped them maximize their success while minimizing their dangers. The division of plunder from successful raids followed established customs that balanced individual merit with collective effort. The ship's captain typically received the largest share, followed by experienced warriors and specialists such as smiths or healers. Even the youngest crew members received portions that could establish them as men of property when they returned home. The impact of Viking raiding on European society extended far beyond the immediate damage inflicted during attacks. Coastal communities abandoned exposed locations for more defensible sites, trade routes were disrupted or abandoned entirely, and resources that might have been used for constructive purposes were diverted to defense against Viking attacks. The very possibility of raids created a climate of fear that influenced everything from architectural styles to political structures. The response of European rulers to Viking raids evolved gradually from surprise and panic to more organized forms of resistance. Fortifications were built or strengthened, naval forces were organized to patrol coastal waters, and diplomatic efforts were made to divide Viking leaders against each other. Some rulers, like Alfred the Great of Wessex, developed comprehensive strategies that combined military resistance with political accommodation. The religious interpretation of Viking raids varied widely among Christian observers. Some saw them as divine punishment for the sins of Christian society, while others viewed them as tests of faith that would ultimately strengthen the church. The martyr cults that developed around monks killed in Viking attacks became important elements in medieval religious culture. The cultural exchange that accompanied Viking raiding was often overlooked by contemporary observers, but proved historically significant. Viking warriors encountered new technologies, artistic styles, and ideas during their expeditions, which they brought back to Scandinavia. Similarly, the regions they raided were exposed to Scandinavian cultural influences that affected everything, from language to legal practices. The seasonal nature of Viking raiding reflected the agricultural calendar of Scandinavian society. Raids typically took place during the spring and summer months when weather conditions were favorable for sea travel, and when agricultural work did not require the full attention of potential raiders. This seasonal pattern gave potential victims some predictability while limiting the Vikings' operational flexibility. The evolution of Viking raiding tactics showed remarkable adaptability to changing conditions and countermeasures. Early raids emphasized speed and surprise, but as defenses improved, Viking leaders developed new approaches including larger expeditions capable of conducting siege warfare, alliances with local rivals of their targets, and the establishment of fortified bases that could support extended campaigns. The role of women in Viking raiding culture was complex and varied. While women rarely participated in raids directly, they played crucial roles in managing the domestic affairs that made extended expeditions possible, and some, like the legendary Shield Maidens, may have taken active roles in combat. Women also served as important links in the kinship networks that held raiding crews together. The mythology that surrounded Viking raiding helped justify and glamorize activities that other cultures condemned as mere banditry. The concept of dying gloriously in battle and earning a place in Valhalla provided religious sanction for military aggression, while the cult of fame encouraged warriors to seek reputation through bold deeds that would be remembered in saga and song. The economic impact of successful raiding on Scandinavian society was transformative. The wealth that flowed back from expeditions funded the construction of larger ships, better weapons, and more elaborate fortifications. It also supported the development of craft specialization and trade networks that connected Scandinavia to markets throughout Europe and beyond. The diplomatic consequences of Viking raiding included not just the obvious hostility between raiders and their victims, but also complex relationships with rulers who sometimes found it more practical to pay tribute than to maintain expensive defenses. The emergence of the Dangeld system in England and similar arrangements elsewhere represented recognition that Viking raids had become a permanent feature of the European political landscape. The legacy of the early Viking raids extended far beyond their immediate historical impact. They established patterns of Scandinavian expansion that would continue for centuries, created cultural stereotypes that still influence popular perceptions of Vikings, and initiated a period of contact between Scandinavian and European cultures that would ultimately benefit both sides. As you feel yourself drifting toward the peaceful realm of sleep, imagine standing on the windswept coast of Northumbria as evening falls over the scene of that first great Viking raid. The monastery of Lindisfarne stands silhouetted against the darkening sky, its broken walls and scattered stones bearing witness to the day when the age of Viking expansion began with fire and sword. In the distance, the longships that brought destruction have vanished beyond the horizon, carrying their crews and their treasure back to Scandinavian fjords, where the success of this expedition will be celebrated in mead halls and remembered in songs. But they have left behind something more lasting than the physical damage they inflicted. They have opened a new chapter in European history, one in which the northern seas will become highways for warriors and merchants, explorers and settlers, who will reshape the medieval world. The raid on Lindisfarne was just the beginning. In the years and centuries to follow, Viking longships will carry their crews to every corner of Europe and beyond, bringing both destruction and innovation, conquest and commerce, terror and transformation to a world that will never again be quite the same. The age of the raiders from the north has begun, and with it comes 3 centuries of adventure, exploration, and expansion that will carry the Norse peoples from their Scandinavian homelands to the gates of Constantinople, the shores of America, and the very edge of the medieval world's imagination. The spray of North Atlantic waves crashes over the bow of Leif Erikson's longship Lucky as she battles through seas that no European has ever sailed before. It is the year 1001 CE, and somewhere ahead lies a coastline that will change history, the wooded shores of what the Vikings will call Vinland, but which we know as North America. 500 years before Columbus, these Norse explorers are about to achieve one of humanity's greatest feats of exploration. But this journey to the edge of the world did not begin with a single bold leap across the ocean. It was the culmination of centuries of gradual expansion westward, each generation of Viking explorers pushing a little further into the unknown, island hopping across the North Atlantic in vessels that were marvels of medieval technology but which seem impossibly fragile for such vast and dangerous waters. The story begins in the Shetland Islands, those wind-swept outposts north of Scotland where Viking settlers established their first permanent foothold beyond Scandinavia. Here, on islands where the summer sun barely sets and winter storms can last for weeks, Norse farmers and fishermen learned to adapt their traditional ways of life to new environments and different challenges. The Shetlands became a stepping stone to the Faroe Islands, those mysterious peaks rising from the North Atlantic mists like the shoulders of sleeping giants. Viking explorers reached the Faroes around 800 CE, finding islands that were perfect for their sheep and hardy enough to support small communities of settlers who could serve as waypoints for expeditions pushing even further west. The greatest leap came around 870 CE, when Viking navigators led by Ingolfur Arnarsson established the first permanent settlement in Iceland. This was no mere raiding expedition, but a carefully planned colonization effort that brought entire families with their livestock, tools, and household goods across hundreds of miles of treacherous ocean to establish new lives on the edge of the Arctic Circle. Iceland proved to be both blessing and curse for the Viking colonists. The island offered abundant fish, vast grazing lands, and freedom from the increasingly centralized kingships that were consolidating power in Scandinavia. But it also presented challenges that tested Norse ingenuity and determination to their limits: volcanic eruptions, harsh winters, and the constant threat of famine when supply ships failed to arrive from the homeland. The society that emerged in Iceland was unlike anything else in medieval Europe. With no native population to conquer or displace, the Viking settlers created a commonwealth based on the assembly system they had brought from Scandinavia, but modified to suit their new circumstances. The Althing, established in 930 CE, became one of the world's first parliaments, where free farmers gathered annually to make laws, settle disputes, and conduct the business of their unique society. But Iceland was not the end of Viking expansion westward. Around 982 CE, Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for killing a neighbor in a dispute over borrowed property, discovered and named Greenland in an early example of medieval marketing. The ice-covered island's name was chosen to attract settlers to what Eric knew would be a difficult land to colonize. The Greenland settlements that Eric established represented one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of exploration. Here, at the edge of the habitable world, Norse colonists created communities that would survive for over 400 years, adapting their traditional ways of life to an Arctic environment that challenged every assumption about agriculture, animal husbandry, and human survival. The eastern settlement, established around Brattahlid, modern Qasiarsuk, became the capital of Norse Greenland, with a cathedral, royal residences, and all the institutions of medieval European civilization transplanted to a land of glaciers and midnight sun. The western settlement, further north and even more challenging, demonstrated the extraordinary determination of people willing to push the boundaries of human habitation to their absolute limits. The Greenland Norse developed unique cultural adaptations that allowed them to survive in their harsh environment. They learned hunting techniques from the indigenous Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, adopted new clothing styles suitable for Arctic conditions, and developed trade relationships that connected their isolated communities to markets in Europe through exports of walrus ivory, Arctic fox furs, and other exotic products. It was from Greenland that the final leap was made to North America. Around 1000 CE, Bjarni Herjolfsson, blown off course during a voyage from Iceland to Greenland, sighted unknown coastlines to the west. His accounts of forested lands rich in timber, a precious commodity in treeless Greenland, inspired Leif Erikson to organize the expedition that would make the Vikings the first Europeans to set foot on American soil. The saga accounts of Leif's voyage describe a careful exploration of 3 distinct regions that the Vikings named Helluland, land of flat stones, probably Baffin Island, Markland, forest land, probably Labrador, and Vinland, wineland or meadowland, probably Newfoundland. At Vinland, Leif established a camp that he called Leif's Booths, which became the first European settlement in North America.